Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Galaxie, and I just need to talk about the fantasy genre for like 20 minutes. I've just had that sort of year. It just needs to happen. So give me this one rant. Also, just really quick, I do want to apologize for the lighting in this video, and also I'm standing this time. I'm trying something new. I'm still figuring things out, and it's kind of late in the day, and I probably should have recorded this in the morning, but it's fine. Don't judge me. When I say the word fantasy, you probably think of elves and hobbits and Lord of the Rings or The Witcher or maybe even Critical Role, and I won't judge you, but I am side-eyeing you if the first thing you think of is Game of Thrones and House of Dragons. But what about Legends and Lattes, Howl's Moving Castle, Witch Hat Atelier, Dungeon Meshi, Dragon Riders of Pern, How to Train Your Dragon? Now, of course, you're probably like, Galaxie, I only recognize like one or two of those names. They must not be popular. And to that I say, no, they're just not the kind of fantasy that people respect. Part 1, why is dark fantasy the most adapted? So you may have noticed that a lot of the things that I listed in the first group have adaptations, which is part of why I listed these the way that I did. Things like Lord of the Rings and Critical Role are good examples of more of the traditional heroic fantasy that in many ways started with The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. That being said, I would argue that they haven't been the most popular fantasy in recent years. While both are really popular, I think what people forget is that the Rings of Power and The Legend of Vox Machina aren't really the norm in the fantasy adaptations we're commonly seeing nowadays. In fact, when I finally watched The Rings of Power, I was actually incredibly refreshed to see that while it dealt with really dark themes, it didn't feel like a dark fantasy in the way that the Game of Thrones, House of Dragons, and The Witcher TV show do. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this. For one, the Lord of the Rings universe isn't really suited to dark fantasy. The crux of both The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and The Silmarillion is that there is hope out there, and that even the smallest among us can be heroes and go on adventures. And that's just not the case with something like Game of Thrones, which as a series is overall pretty hopeless and sad. I would argue that The Witcher is a bit better on this front, but even still, as I've read the Witcher books, it's pretty clear that there were elements of the stories which were gutted strictly to make the Netflix series more dark, gritty, and less magical. Which kind of leads me to my point here. Dark fantasy, in a lot of ways, tends to be easier to adapt than heroic or high fantasy does. When you compare something like The Witcher and the Rings of Power series, this is incredibly obvious. Geralt throughout the story is in tattered dark clothes, because he's emo, and spends the majority of his time in peasant towns and swamps. This is much more to build and create than a dark forest where a single guy is talking to his horse, or maybe he's not, and there's an annoying but lovable bard with him. The less magic needed, the less CGI, the cheaper the production is. The less magical creatures and species, the fewer specialized sets needed to make someone look like a hobbit. The less mythical of the location, the more likely you can get away with just using an existing town somewhere in the middle of nowhere. Basically, the money comes first, then the art does, and that's part of the reason we see more dark fantasy adapted than anything else. And the reason I'm saying all of this is because my actual point is next, and I didn't want to deal with a bunch of people in the comments telling me all about how expensive high fantasy is to film and all of that. So here you are. I'm acknowledging that it is expensive to make a high fantasy series or a high fantasy movie. Are you happy? However, I think there's a particular darkness that has persisted in our media for a long time that is undeniably part of the reason that dark fantasy is looked to first when adapting fantasy for the screen. I mean, they literally took Superman, a symbol of hope and a goofy journalist who loves his mom, and made his storyline dark and gritty. And arguably with Superman, it's because Zack Snyder has an undeniably misunderstood view of Superman as a character, but I think that showrunners and directors in general tend to have a penchant for the dark as a way to make things more realistic. Part 2, why is the push towards realism bad? Wait, double check everything. Oh my god, the lighting is getting worse. I'm so sorry. What if I just like, oh god, it's blinding. What if I squat for the next like 5 minutes? Okay, let me try to, maybe if I like move my ring light like right here, it will help. Nope. It's basically gonna be on my face. Okay, nothing is gonna beat the sun right now. I am gonna move slightly this way. That sort of helps. It at least evens out the coloring of my face. Sorry for the slight change. The lighting was getting so bad, I moved. First of all, I think we can all agree, bruh, I'm watching fantasy. I want more dragons, not more realism. Anyway, this push towards realism in fantasy, while it has its practical reasons, which I discussed previously, also kind of ruins the heart of many stories. I mean, can you imagine if Miyazaki looked at Howl's Moving Castle, the book, and said, actually, it would be better and more realistic if Howl dies saving Sophie at the end. This is not a dig on Miyazaki. I don't think he would actually say that. Anyway, anime was a mistake. That would be a fundamental misunderstanding of the story and the significance of the experiences that both Howl and Sophie go through throughout the book. Unfortunately, many Western showrunners and directors are going much further than character death. In fact, many of them turn up the violence in dark fantasy series just for the shock value of it. I'm looking at you, Game of Thrones. Also, especially the violence against women, but that's a different video. But also, I think there's a huge issue with particularly the way in which dark fantasy is often adapted to the screen. As I said already, it often leans into physical and sexual violence for shock value, often choosing to add even more in an attempt to surprise original fans of the series. But also, I think there's a huge issue with particularly the way in which dark fantasy is often adapted to the screen. As I said already, it often leans heavily into physical and sexual violence for shock value, often choosing to add even more of it in an attempt to surprise original fans of the series who already know what's going to happen because they read the books. Which, spoiler alert, is a bad way to do an adaptation just generally. Nobody watches an adaptation to be surprised, they watch to enjoy a new look at the story that they already love. Which, spoiler alert, is a bad way to do an adaptation just generally. Nobody watches an adaptation to be surprised, they watch it to enjoy a new look at a story they already love. Promised Neverland is a big example of messing this up royally. And the reason I bring up Promised Neverland is specifically because the people who made the anime made comments along the lines of, we wanted to give viewers a new experience, which is very much not what somebody wants out of an adaptation. Another big issue I have is with what we just talked about the emphasis on realism in fantasy that I personally think degrades the fantasy genre as a whole. Now, these are still fantasy series. There's often still magic and all sorts of things which happen that aren't realistic. However, this also comes with a level of making the world less magical, often for no reason. The best example I have of this is at the end of season 1 of The Witcher when Geralt finally finds Ciri, who is staying with a family of farmers after the fall of Sintra. The family in the show are humans. In the books, they're halflings or dwarves, I can't remember which currently, but the point stands that they were firmly not humans. There's also a lot more magic in the original Game of Thrones book series. I know it's not called Game of Thrones when it's the books that we're talking about, but Game of Thrones is easier to say than a Song of Ice and Fire. Back to The Witcher. Now, yes, I can see why they probably did this. Making the farmers that Ciri is staying with humans makes it easier to film these scenes. However, The Witcher also just used real live little people to represent the dwarves earlier in the show, so if they wanted the scene to have no CGI or special staging like they used in The Hobbits and Lord of the Rings, they could have just hired little people to play the dwarves. Which isn't a perfect solution. I'm not going to speak for little people here. They might not have liked that the show kind of just used little people to represent dwarves, but the show had already done it, so they could have just done it again is my point. Still not speaking for little people, and they are free to correct me in the comments, but I also feel like this would have made the way the dwarves in the Dragon Hunt episode were portrayed, like, slightly better. Like, in that episode, I feel like they fall into some harmful stereotypes that we often see being impressed upon little people in the real world. And having a random family of farmers who are dwarves being played by real-life little people might have made that seem less like that's all the writers think of little people in TV. Like, that they're just good for making jokes a la The Man Show in the early 2000s. Is anyone gonna get that reference beyond me? Guess we'll find out. And in general, The Witcher does this quite a lot, while simultaneously making other things in the world more magical. A good example of them making the events of the books and short stories more magical is the scene in season 1 with Vicenna, Geralt's mother. In the show, things are pretty hazy, and it's really not clear whether or not Vicenna is really there since Geralt's in such a state of nearly dying. In the book, she's just kind of like with a party of people that someone takes Geralt to so that he can get help. That's it. But for me, both of these choices in the adaptation actually ruin some of the impact of these stories. With Ciri staying with dwarves or halflings, it was a direct way that Sapkowski made it clear to the reader that halflings, dwarves, and elves are just like the humans in the series, and there are lots of good people in these groups who are willing to help a child who needs it, even if they're putting themselves at risk in the process. And with Geralt's mother physically being in front of him, it forces the reader to acknowledge Geralt's humanity as nothing more than a man who was abandoned by his mother as a child and left to be experimented on until he became a monster hunter, thus ostracizing him from society completely, or died. I mean, did you know only 1 in 5 boys who go through the trial of grasses survives is a lot more impactful when you know Geralt's mother actually has to hear it and acknowledge that she'd done something wrong. To be honest though, neither of these are nearly as egregious as what they did to Renfri's story, but I could make a whole separate video on that. Let me know if you want me to. But spoiler for that video, the show basically confirming that Renfri was in fact a monster ruins the entire point of that short story. Anyway though, my point here is that dark fantasy, while it lends itself to being made less magical for the sake of easier filming, this also tends to harm the story being told. And that sucks because overall many dark fantasy stories are incredibly gripping and force people to face real-world problems head-on. To use an example from science fiction, this would be like removing the gender neutrality of the people of Gethin from The Left Hand of Darkness, or deciding that Worf from Star Trek The Next Generation should actually be Vulcan instead of Klingon. Both of these things would irreparably harm the stories being told, and both the gender neutrality of the people of Gethin and Worf being Klingon were clearly meant to critique and combat real-life sexism, homophobia, and racism. So my point here is, these showrunners can't even get dark fantasy right. And that's because they often aren't respecting the core tenets of the genre of fantasy. Fantasy is inherently linked with magic and otherworldliness, and it uses those things to critique the real world. Something that people seem to frequently forget is a core part of speculative fiction at large. And honestly, the worst part of all of this is that it means that sometimes fantasy, which is not dark fantasy, is adapted as if it was. I mean, just take a look at Fate the Winx Saga and tell me that they didn't fundamentally misunderstand the point of the original series. Part 3, adapting fantasy well. Okay, so I've talked a lot about the bad parts of adapting fantasy. Now let's talk about what can be done really well when adapting fantasy. For one thing, I think especially when you get adaptations of Arthurian legends like Merlin and Cursed, you'll quickly find that fantasy is a wonderful way to express and critique feelings of otherness. This is actually something I decided to explore in depth in my own book because it's something that I've struggled with in my real life. Subtle plug for my book. It's coming out this year. Don't worry, you guys will get more information about that soon. Merlin actually does this incredibly well throughout the series, and though I think to an extent the showrunners chickened out by not having Merlin confess some sort of romantic or queer platonic feelings for Arthur, Merlin started coming out in like 2008, so there wasn't actually much hope that that would happen at all. At least Morgana didn't end up in a relationship with a man for no reason. But as I talked about in my Merlin video, the way that magic is used in that show and the fact that it's outlawed in Camelot makes for a story that a lot of queer people probably related to an incredibly deep level. Merlin as a character often feels like a closeted queer person struggling to reckon with his own identity without losing the people around him, often fearing exile or worse, death if anyone is to find out his secret. This show and story wouldn't be nearly as good if Merlin didn't have magic, and well, you might be going, well, obviously he's Merlin, he has to have magic. Okay, let's talk about Gwen's story from Merlin then. It's warm, I ditched the vest. Guinevere is the blacksmith's daughter, played by a black woman who ultimately forms a close bond with the prince and later marries him. However, Arthur's father didn't want him to marry her because she's not a noble, and I don't think it's a coincidence that this storyline was included in the show. While the king is never actually outright racist to Gwen, he is incredibly classist towards her, and also some of Arthur's knights, honestly, but that's not the point right now. There's a direct correlation that can be drawn in a viewer's mind between Gwen's lower social class and her race. And I'm sure for many young black women, seeing Gwen fight and work alongside Merlin and Arthur on many occasions was probably very validating. She even becomes queen at the end of the series, which I can imagine probably felt really good as far as representation goes. But here's the thing, I'm going to ask you, would Gwen's story have come off as well and been even included at all in the series if she were, say, a black noble that the king was outright racist towards. I personally don't think it would have been included, and I think if they had included it, it probably would have been handled in a rather clunky way. And if she'd still been a blacksmith's daughter who the king was racist towards, what would that accomplish for the story? If anything, it probably would have just resulted in, at best, Arthur having some weird white savior lines about how it doesn't matter that Gwen is black, and at worst, Arthur probably would have needed to have a I'm no longer racist arc, which, let's be real, probably wouldn't have been done well. And that's my whole point here. The fantasy world that this story existed in facilitated Gwen's arc and provided an opportunity for a black woman to not only play a lead role on a hit show, it facilitated the opportunity for a black woman to play Guinevere, a literal queen. Now, I'm gonna pause here to say I am white, and I'm sure there are a lot of other problems with Gwen's story and representation throughout Merlin, but I'm just trying to use this as an example of how writing within a fantasy world allows for those kinds of stories to be told. I think we also see this work really well in The Green Knight. Now, I have qualms about certain aspects of this movie, but one thing I have to give it is that they didn't at all make the story of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight any less magical. And in fact, this is one of the few moments in which we see added sex scenes in medieval fantasy, which aren't, just a chance for an uncomfortably long sexual assault scene. There are a lot of opportunities in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight to try and explain, cut things for runtime, or even to try and make them more logical. What I appreciated about the movie overall is that it didn't do that. It often let the audience sit with the weirdness and discomfort that comes from the magical aspects of the story. They're able to thrive and slowly unnerve the audience until we get this single climactic scene where Gawain sees his entire awful life flash before his eyes and he decides to take off the girdle. Everything from the talking fox to the strange giants who try to pick Gawain up stay largely unexplained. And where they did add things or take liberties, it didn't take away from the otherworldliness. For example, the fact that they made Morgan Le Fay Gawain's mother and had the same actress play both Essel and the Lady Bertilac of the castle expands upon the meaning of the trials and tests that Gawain is facing. This is a world in which magic is confusing and at times rather dark, but it's also intrinsically linked to how the story is told. And the adaptation expanded upon the source material's magic rather than trying to limit it for the sake of budget. And in not shying away from the magic rooted in its source material, The Green Knight is easily one of the better adaptations of Arthurian legends generally. But it is also a better adaptation of fantasy source material than we've seen in a very long time. And I think it shares a lot of aspects with the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings series, which is an incredible adaptation of rather complicated source material that didn't shy away from the magic. Both of these adaptations were able to uphold the core critiques which existed in the original text, and while it means we lost Tom Bombadil, it also means we kept the Ents. Which, can you imagine if they tried to cut the Ents from those movies? How could you even do The Lord of the Rings without the battle between the literal tree people and a polluting metal fortress with smoke coming out of it, which is the most ham-fisted representation of pollution and industrialization to ever exist ever? Sorry, but if you think there is a more heavy-handed representation of pollution and industrialization, you are incorrect. Part 4. Final thoughts. Do better. Okay, so I'll fully admit that all of this was sort of a rant, but my point here is that not only is fantasy a wonderful and diverse genre with lots of different subgenres that I think showrunners and directors should be treating with more respect, it's also about the fact that fantasy as a genre requires its world to be magical. Its world is as much a part of its character as any of the characters are. And honestly, if you're worried about trying to make an adaptation because of budgeting concerns for all of the dragons you want or something, perhaps consider animation, because honestly, it handles fantasy really well. I know that's unrealistic though, and it's not like showrunners and directors are ever going to see this video, so I don't know, I felt the need to tell you all for some reason. I'll stop now. Fantasy is something that is incredibly important to me, and I have spent years honing in on the kinds of fantasy that I enjoy and just honestly wish more of it was getting good adaptations that don't try to make it feel like Game of Thrones. And what I mean by that is that I just want good adaptations where they don't strip the heart out of the story for the sake of realism or darkness or making it like Game of Thrones because they think that's gonna market well. And I mean, there's nothing worse than one of your favorite series or books getting a bad movie or TV adaptation, and with so few TV series actually getting off the ground and staying afloat, I really wish more people involved in the writing and creation of these adaptations would respect the genre for what it is. And the original stories. I am looking at you, writing room of The Witcher. Why do you guys keep commenting that you don't even like these books? I don't understand. I know they have their problems, but why do you want to work on the project? if you don't like the source material. Also, just please stop equating less magic to more realism. That doesn't even make a lot of sense when you think about it, and especially when it comes to fantasy. Anyway, thank you for listening to me rant. I appreciate you all so much. Honestly, I am still thrilled with like how my channel has done, and my shorts have been getting a lot of love, so thank you for that. Here are other places you can follow me. Please consider checking out my Patreon if you're interested in supporting me and the things that I make on here, and look out for more updates about my book coming soon. More than likely, updates about my book will probably come out on my TikTok. Admittedly, I'm probably gonna plaster it over all of my socials, but TikTok is probably the place you will see the most out of it. Hello, welcome. I am here really quickly to just pop in here and tell you all about Feathers of Dawn. So I was originally going to make this a little bit more formal, but my lighting situation, my recording situation is still not very formal. So I decided to just like pop it in at the end of this video. As you can tell, Feathers of Dawn is the name of my debut novel. You can now find it at feathersofdawn.com. You can also find an opportunity to sign up for advanced readers copies of Feathers of Dawn here on this lovely website that I made that has very little on it. Another thing on the website though is content warnings, so please check those out before you sign up for an ARC. I just don't want someone to, you know, like feel like they are obligated to read it because they signed up for an ARC or something like that, but there are content warnings for the book on the website. That all being said, I'm still working on getting the book onto like Goodreads and Amazon and all of that. Right now, I am just accepting opportunities for people who may want to read ARCs once they're available. The cover is also not officially out yet, so you get this lovely gradient art that my friend Rachel, who is a professional graphic designer, made for me, and I really appreciate it because hers looked much better than mine, which is saying a lot considering this is very simple and my design was very simple, and hers is still so much better. That all being said, I wanted to let you guys know that Feathers of Dawn will be coming out November 3rd, 2023. Hopefully, fingers crossed, if something changes, you can find out more information on all of my main social medias. So that's at Jess Galaxie YT on Twitter, at GalaxieBot on YouTube, at GalaxieBot on TikTok. I also have an at Jess Galaxie account on TikTok now if you would like to go and follow it. I just wanted to have a place to just talk about writing a little bit more. If you don't know about how TikTok works, once you've kind of like worked yourself into a niche, any video that you put out not in that niche will never do well. So I wanted to make a separate account that was different from my Dungeons and Dragons account. And that's why that exists. So that all being said, I really appreciate all of you guys for supporting me. If you want to hear a little bit more or learn a little bit more about the book, you can check out any of my other social media accounts. They've got information. Look out for a cover reveal because I am so excited. I've been working with one of my absolute favorite artists. I will talk about that when the time comes, but I'm excited. That's all I wanted to say. Please, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, put it in the comments down below. Follow me on all of my various social medias. They're all in the website, so if you need to go and find them, they're there. And yeah, thank you so much for being supportive. And look out for Feathers of Dawn, November 3rd, 2023. Okay, bye now. Anyway, yeah. Thank you for listening. This is the end of the video. I don't know what to do ever at the end of my videos. Shiro, sir, he is eating my slipper right now, in front of my face. Waiting for the teleprompter to move. Josh, stop calling me. Stop it. We want girls on trampolines. So, do you guys like my elf ears? I think... I slapped these on last second and I was just like, I was doing it and I was like, oh, I guess I've committed to taking a shower tonight because I'm not going to bed with spirit gum on my ears. Also, I have spirit gum on my ears, which have attached these ears to my ears. I'm not sure where my baby oil is or my spirit gum remover. I'm in danger. Anyway, goodbye. Bye.